Sound check 1 2.
Sound check 1 2.
Sound check 1 2.
Sound check 1 2.
Alrighty, we are ready to rock and roll, and I am Jonathan Albin, and welcome to Nycos News, the network, the organization, the process by which we are sharing the information about neural youth conditioning and how we can improve our ability to operate within this world, and also grab a hold of and engage our active imagination in our everyday environment. Now, to give a quick background for those of you that may not be familiar, I'm a storyteller and game master for all forms of tabletop games, in particular role play games such as Dungeons and Dragons and the like. And I could go on to a litany, but more than likely that's the only one you may have actually heard of. So this is an inaugural episode, if you will, of my series Games Mastery. And although I have done a lot of work in the past in terms of developing an academy for game players and in particular storytellers to improve their craft, today I want to talk about Games Mastery from a slightly different angle, and that is I will be covering the topics that by definition go into role-play game creation, but I want to do so from the position of how it assists in the development of our character in ways beyond the standard game environment, and actually talk about how it can apply in literally your everyday life to take advantage of the Nycos system to expand your creativity, your youthfulness, your sense of humor, and in just about every way imaginable. We're going to be talking about, in this case, the first four that I have here posted: character building, design features, establishing tradition, and foundations of the world. These terms are set up so that they are referring to the things that you would develop in a game environment, but I want to be speaking more metaphorically perhaps, or maybe even more tangentially accurately in terms of how we can use it in our actions on a day-to-day basis with the people in our lives and such. So if you'll pardon me, I am a one-person shop, so I'll be doing some of the technical stuff from this seat. If you do happen upon the channel and wish to interact, I totally embrace that, and I hope that you will feel comfortable with hopping into the chat room, saying hello. If you like what you see, definitely want to follow the channel, subscribe if you like to become a part of it that way. And if you want additional information beyond what you see on the screen, I do have a Patreon account, patreon.com/Nycos, NYCOS, as in the sign above my head here. And I don't even know if I even got the right fingers are pointing the right area. Sometimes I get my mirror backwards. But so there are a lot of ways you can get involved, but the main thrust of this conversation today is going to be talking about these four specific delineations of the process in ways of referring to games mastery in terms of things beyond just the tabletop. So before we jump into it and get going, I do want to thank my sponsor. If you notice down here in the corner, can my hand get high enough to see it? No, it didn't. There you go. Over here in the corner is the logo for Board Games Paradise. They are my show sponsor, and they are a game store, full-service game store in Redlands, California. Granted, that's a local concern out here in Southern California, but if you're in the area and are seeking a place to pick up some new games properties, maybe see what else is new on the marketplace, they are full service. They cover card games, board games, role-play games, miniatures games, the gamut. And the owner and the staff there are just incredible. And make sure when you do, you mention Nycos to them, because our relationship is that it's one of the few places where I do public appearances, in that I run an active role-play game session at Board Games Paradise Monday nights at 6 p.m. California time. So if you want to become a part of that, you can definitely drop in on the site. It's on State Street in downtown Redlands, California. And you can go to their website, which is, of course, boardgamesparadise.com. So with that, without further ado, pardon me, I will be from time to time imbibing from a non-adult beverage. The cup holder here is made by a very good friend of mine. It's always in the wrong. Got to learn how to present again. Been a while. Too far over. It's vanishing anyway. These are vanishing from stock because the friend of mine who makes them uses his 3D printer, then hand paints each one, and we'd love additional business for him. So if you want more information on him, leave a message below or drop it in the chat, and I will endeavor to communicate with you to figure out how to get one of these to you. Alrighty, so let's kick this off, shall we? Do my little bit of song and dance here on the actual board. Ba 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 ba. That's my time-taking verbalization there. Ba 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 ba. All right. I like it when he goes ba 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 ba. Alrighty. So we're going to be talking about character building. So, in role-play games, in order to affect the game mechanism, you have to have developed a character. Now, we all have personalities. We all have played, when we were children, at least, we definitely played games where we took on the roles of other people and pretended to be them for a period of time. In this case, character, the concept of character building is that you are creating a alternate personality, alternate identity, if you will, for the sake of engaging in the game. Now, in our world today, there are a lot of people that are really interested in identity politics and identity terminology and things like that. And so in the games environment, and I'd argue perhaps some people may even think that we're in a simulation today. I saw that argument on a live stream the other day. The idea that we are living within a framework gives us the opportunity, or affords us the opportunity to develop a character. Now, this phrase of character building, I'm wanting to take us beyond that mechanism and say, what do we do to build our characters here in the world? Now, it'll be done in a juxtaposition because the game world, quite frankly, pardon my magical hand waving that retrain the focus on my camera, it sometimes freaks out and I get a little fuzzy. And you'll notice I keep plucking my eyebrow. It's a family affectation. I'll have to get away from that. But anyway, the establishment of a character has to do with your presentation to the world. And in a game environment, that means defining attributes. And those attributes, generally speaking, are talking about limits within the game that will be tested from time to time by, hang on a second, I gotta get this off the screen. There we go. My mouse was freaking me out. If you hear that weird dinging sound, that's my phone going off, and every time I get a message from somebody. So if that's you on the screen, I'll get a message from you. If I don't, it'll correspond to a phone beep. So you may hear that, and it's mainly to keep me remembering to look up and see if there's anybody in chat, because quite frankly, I want this to be an engaging show. I don't want this to always be me pontificating, and while I may not be able to keep up with the messages as time goes by, right now there's plenty of space and time, and so as they would say back in the old days, feel free to call in now because the lines are open. All right. Also want to mention, as a quick aside, if you do get involved with Patreon, you do get access to my Discord, and therefore you can actually become a caller, if you will, on the show, and we can actually talk verbally as well. And to some, that's appealing. And second of all, it's quite beneficial for us to do that. I did notice I didn't need to change something here. Ooh. Just down a bit, because I've got a branded jacket on, and I don't have any black tape to put on it right now. So there we go. And anyway, I don't want to get in any brand issue with that organization. I don't get me wrong. I had a really great relationship with them for a period of time, but they're probably more key to those kind of things than I am. And it's even on the right side. To you, it's going to be backwards. No, I don't know. Anyway, going back to the point, character building. And I'll do this for the video edit because I can do this on taking the long form and turning down into short form, going from the live stream back to recorded shows. I can cleverly edit all of that. All right. All right. So character building in the game is developing these attributes that describe the limits of the persona that you're building. How, for example, how strong a person might be, or how wise or smart or speedy, tough. These different characteristics, therefore, become the defining attributes of the character. Well, when we as human beings set out to do so, we don't get a framework of numbers that we can access to. Instead, they are our core. And so, for example, in the Nycos RPG and in Nycos mechanism, we look at those things differently because they do revolve more about our personal will and involvement in our lives, and not just what the piece of paper says about how much I can deadlift or how fast I can run a quarter mile. So instead of speaking of those terms in a limiting way, we look at them in a slightly different way. And so in the terms of building a character, whether it be for a persona or for one's individual self, these are the characteristics that we look at that we call the foundation. And so you'll notice there's going to be a theme that's going to run through all 4 of these sections today. But the concept of character building, therefore, is the concept of developing these 6 foundations. So let's go over them quickly. I'm going to not be putting those on the screen now, but I will add in text overs up here mentioning what they are. And now that we kind of know who what the show is, I'm going to move this farther up and move this farther up. And there we go. So with games mastery, we're in this particular case, we're talking about mastering the game of our existence, not just of our role-playing game. And I think you'll see the parallels easily between them, and why the NycosRPG methodology is a expansion or extension into real life. So character building in this case is establishing the foundations for your life. And so, well, and mine, the terms that we use therefore give us a way to kind of drill down into each facet of our identity and describe it more clearly. So these, I think you'll find that there's some things that are shockingly missing from this conversation that are being touted everywhere else. And so I hope for this to sort of be an awakening, if you will, an activation of your imagination beyond the framework that you're used to, and to get you to think about all of these terms in a slightly different way. It's a form of paradigm shift is what I'm asking, or I'm endeavoring to create. So without any more, let's go to it. First of all, your first characteristic, or the first that is described here, and I'm using basically an alphabetic order to these rather than any kind of valuation statement. I'm not setting one of these above the others in that kind of way. But character building begins with brilliance. And to better describe this, I'm not speaking of brilliance in terms of an IQ test or genius quotient or even a personality matrix. like the Myers-Briggs or whatever. The mechanism here for brilliance is just a quantification of maximum physical capability. So brilliance encompasses things like acuity, detail, the capacity to identify and specify detail, a concept of book learning speed, study skills, and all of these things. And so, pardon me. So brilliance is, in a standard role play game, they have a stat for your intellect or for your knowledge or whatever. And these terms are all depending on which game mechanism you're using, and almost all of them have a set. Ooh, that's really funky. Got to fix that camera. It's probably because the table's vibrating a little or something. I don't know. But the aspect of brilliance is it's a default, if you will, concerning with things doing with the mind, mental agility and things like that. So just realize that brilliance is referring to a mentality. Now, in our lives, we certainly have enough testing of that, don't we? We have our educational system that, at least in theory, has a graduated success-fail rating for each attribute, each category of knowledge: mathematics, science, history, language skills, communication skills, blah, blah, blah. These all have ways of being graduated. Brilliance encompasses all of those mental aspects. It's not specifically set up to limit or define one or more of them, but it's instead to try to encompass all of them. And I think you'll see these within relationship to one another, why it's important to delineate them from each other for the purposes of drilling down and improving them. Not that you're, for example, you may have a certain skills list on how you learn, and therefore it's not that I can change the way in which you learn, but I can perhaps provide you with ways to make the learning categorizations better. So you can improve your reading skill, you can improve your language skills, which, by the way, would be a great place to put a sponsor line if I had one. So we'll be looking in the future for those as well, and I'm certain that we'll be able to get to those relatively quickly, because this is going to be a way of elevating these elevating our character in reference to these skills. That's the best way to say it. All right, so beyond brilliance, you have cognition, or your cognitive capability, and cognition is the state of awareness. Now, to many people's thinking, the idea of being aware it's natural. It's an attribute that has to do with your ability to hear, your ability to see, the relationship you have within the framework of the world with what you can act upon versus what is going on in the background. This ability to be cognitive, or to have cognition, is I guess a form of alertness and observation, but it's more than that. And it also is scalable, because each of these base attributes, these base foundations, are only setting a framework upon which we build. And so your developing of your character, the expansion of who you are in terms of cognition, is made up of all of these different little skills that can be learned. You can become more discriminate in your ability to hear. You can become more versed in vocabulary, so that the words that are being used are discernible in the context of the conversation, and therefore improve your ability to communicate back to the speaker and such like. Third among these is grace, and this is one of the ones that is probably the easiest to keep in the idea of a foundation, because many of us don't even consider our relationship with the world in terms of our grace. Grace is not only how speedily you can act, which it does cover, but it's also how that maneuvering or that movement flows with the world around you. I'm constantly minded of those people who are in the food services industry that can carry those huge trays of food and still navigate through the line of 8-year-olds on the way to the playroom or the bathrooms or whatever, and they can just navigate that tray with style and ease, and that's a form of grace. Our ability to speak with each other without interrupting, even though that's, you would think that almost sounds like an intellectual thing. It's also a matter of speed, because if your brain is running faster than the communication and you're not actually integrating what you're hearing from the spokesman, you are fumbling with your grace because you're going to interrupt and things like this. So grace is more than just speed, but it's also coordination in terms of movement and action. Once you get past those, the next one is presence. And presence is probably the easiest and most natural of all of our foundations to understand, but also one of the ones that is most difficult to improve upon until we recognize it for what it is. Presence is literally the space you take in a room when you are there. I have to admit that I am often said to have a rather big presence, because when I am in a conversation, I generally am the center of that conversation, whether it be by intention or accident, because I tend to, well, my former employer used to call me Big J, and I'm not near as Big J as I used to be in terms of weight loss, and that's a completely different issue. But that has to do with this presence, because it also has to do with the cultural things that we're dealing with now, as far as body dysmorphism and stuff. The persona, the presence that we bring into the room is going to define how others react to us, and that presence can be a very strong thing or it can be very weak. And in the same fashion within all of the other attributes, the numeric value is referring to the default state and not my training, and not our training and not our expression of it, but simply the default condition of our existence in terms of how we interact with others. So presence is more of an outward appearance thing than the others, perhaps. Presence can also be in reference to brusqueness and coarseness and personality, things like that. So there's a lot more that goes into presence, but we'll come to each one of these in a later point. But just wanted to clarify that presence, therefore, is gravitas, the amount of space you take up in the room, so to speak. The next of these is the concept of resolve. Resolve. No, resistance. I always get those last two mixed up. Resistance is next. Resistance? Yeah, resistance is next. And resistance is our ability to react both physically and emotionally to the input of others. Resilience. I was looking at the notes here. Resilience. It has to do with our ability to bounce back, our tenacity, our ability to shrug off pain, disease, bad attitudes, things like that. Resilience is a foundation that carries with it the specifics of how physically muscular a person is, but also how prone they are to pain, how prone they are to illness and things like this. So a person's resilience really is more of it's the closest you have, if you will, to a physical characteristic, and it's left in the term of resilience because it too, like everything else, can be trainable. It can be expanded, not as the base itself, that's the default of who we are, but for example, the fact that we are willful beings. If I have a low physical resilience, in other words, I respond to pain quickly, I have to learn, therefore, how to be tougher in terms of that physical reaction. And so therefore we have to hold on, recognize that resilience is something that you can train skills to overcome these things. So, and then finally, resolve. And resolve has to do with grim determination and willfulness. Some of us fold at the first brush of a breeze. Some of us, can stand against a torrent, and some are, rocks. we can take whatever the world dishes out. Mentally, we can. Somebody, when I was a little boy, the phrase used to be "sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never hurt you." And we learned to take that internally, that if somebody said something that we didn't like, we internally toughened up. And our world seems to have reversed that to the point where you're supposed to actually be harmed more greatly by things that people say than you are by the things that they do. And that's somewhat problematic, but we will, in later terms, go to that. But just realize that, therefore, now we've talked about each of the 6 of them. And then resolve, this last one, just one quick other note about resolve. Resolve is the ability to hold a decision once it's been made. If you cannot resolve an issue, it means you cannot get a handle on how it should be functioning. And so, now that we've talked about each of them in the group, let me talk about the Foundation's overall connection. And some might consider this to be sort of a philosophical framework, but the idea is that these 6 frames, these 6 foundations, brilliance, cognizance, grace, presence, resolve, and resilience, these 6 all combine, if you will, to define who we are. And somebody looking at you through, let's say if we were talking about someone walking up to me over a distance, there's going to be things that they'll be able to make out about me from a long distance away, but those things will only become clear when they are aware of me and communicating with me and engaging. And in the same fashion, your foundations, these 6 pedestals, if you will, are therefore collectively seen as the base of who you are. And so sometimes when we're speaking both metaphorically and in terms of the game, I will define these things separately. But the idea of the base is that all of your attributes, all 6 of these defining characteristics, aggregate to come up with the fundamental strength of who you are, the fundamental numeric value, if you were doing it in a game mechanism, of who you were. And that number collectively can only be 100% of who you are, because if you have facts not in evidence, doesn't mean that they change the framework of who you are. They just amplify or narrow the description of those items. So when we speak about character building, we're going to be talking about ways to improve on these 6 foundation pedestals, or on the base collectively. In traditional role-play games, up until this point, the role-play games never actually address how they collectively work, how those numbers combine to become the individual. They are individually treated as numbers that can be, depending on the system, improvable. So in other words, you might have a value for your physical strength. And because you have a number for your physical strength, you can actually improve your numerical value for that attribute by working out, or with lifting weights, or carrying a burden for a long period of time. These are all ways that a character could, quote, build its strength. But in the real world, the physical prowess that we have can be defined by the things that we can do, and that's certainly true. You could certainly pick up a skill in weightlifting, regardless of your size, weight, whatever. You can actually pick up that skill and use it because you chose to pursue that skills base. But that skills base is only defining a part of your resilience, if you get my meaning. It's only a part of who you are. And therefore, to realize that we can have literally an infinite number of skills associated with these means that we as individuals, just as much as the persona or the character that we play in a role-play game, those numbers can be improved by building the skill in supplanting the raw strength. In other words, or the raw attribute. For example, if you are building like a weight training program, or bulking up and building your physical being, that's also going to affect your grace, isn't it? Because maybe you're getting stronger, but if you're not learning also to control that musculature, you can actually end up, breaking things or whatever. So it needs to be an aggregate across all of them, and the only way that happens is that by it, you have to attribute some of that advancement into a skill rather than an actual one of the attributes directly. You can't become a more, it breaks down over time, doesn't it? All right, so realize, therefore, when I speak about character building on the show, I'm talking about character building in terms of the persona, if we're speaking of a role-play game. But if we're not talking about that, when I'm talking about character building, I'm talking about how we change the way we are defined, both as a base person, as a physically stable person, and as the aggregate of our attributes, and perhaps an emphasis beyond them onto our skills bases. So I wanted to go over that because as we look into the next section, when we go into design features, we're going to be looking at it from a completely different framework and not at all to deal with the persona. So let me switch my bumpers here just a second. All right, so now we're going to talk about design features. Many of us have been in sales environments, sales training, customer service training, and such, and we learn that we have to be able to describe the features of product X, object X, plan Y, whatever. These design features are the things that other people will want to interact with and why they are a positive thing for whatever the product or service is that we're talking about. So when I speak of design features, I'm talking about what is it that's in our lives individually that distinguishes us from others in the same framework or in the same environment. For example, a design feature for a person's life could be the kind of car he drives. I drive a 1995 Subaru wagon because of its adaptability in terms of being able to carry all of my stuff, its fuel economy, which being a 1995 is actually fairly good for its age. It's rugged in terms of the environment, as far as when I have to drive up the mountain to Big Bear or run down to the beach in Newport or whatever. This vehicle covers the utility in a lot of different functions. As a matter of fact, today's use of the term sports utility vehicle would have qualified for this station wagon back in the day, but the terminology wasn't yet developed to call it that, so it was a station wagon. The design features of the my mobile home, my motor home. Ferdinand's going to be embarrassed. Ferdinand is my 1985 Winnebago Mini Winnie. I know that's a great term. Fundamentally, it's a Tonka truck, if you've seen it. Not only that, I'll put a picture up in between scenes here in the post-production. And Ferdinand has even a pair of horns on the front because he's stylized as Ferdinand the bull. If you recall, the children's story about Ferdinand is that he was a bull destined to be a bullfighter, a bull in the ring fighting against the matadors and toreadors and picadors, etc., etc. But he didn't want to fight. he was not a fighter. He loved the smell of roses and would rather smell roses than fight with anybody. So he was a fish out of water, a persona outside of the framework, and his character building is quite fascinating. We could probably do an entire show on Ferdinand at some point in the future, both as a character and as a person, if you will, because we anthropomorphize just about everything. But the design feature of a Ferdinand, of a Winnebago, is he's mobile. If I need to travel to the East Coast for something, I can put fuel in his tanks and check the air in his tires and make sure the brakes are working and be on my way. As a matter of fact, just to mention it, there will be a tour coming up in April. And if you see this show and want to understand more about that, maybe you can become a part of that. We are looking for ongoing sponsors and advocates for that to bring the concepts of games mastery and the Nycos mechanism into every community. So that is going to be set up between here and Dallas, Texas. The tour will begin the early part of April and will end at Dallas for an event there, and then the subsequent return trip home will be included in that tour. So if you're interested in becoming involved with that, you can check out patreon.com. There'll be some detail there. I'm also going to be posting links to the information about it here below. That'll be on my website in the next day or so. So design features for each of these things are broad. For example, I wasn't finished with Ferdinand. Ferdinand is cozy. It's warm inside. He's dry. He doesn't leak out wit. He's got a pretty good load capability. He can carry all of the properties and product and books and stuff that I need to take with me on my tours and such. So these are all things that are designed features. Well, so when we look at our lives, we have to figure out what our design features are. And if we haven't got any established, we need to establish them. So, for example, one of them that a very good friend of mine just recently started using Babbel to learn, and another one, those language lesson things. I'm dedicated to get myself a sponsorship in that category here pretty soon. Communicating with people in languages other than English. In this case, this person is taking Spanish. I know people who took Japanese. I know people. When I worked with a major card game publisher, which I'm not going to mention now, but they had people that they understood foreign language, but they also took with them the concepts of understanding how the English mind works, the person's mind who speaks English works, and became localizers. They actually would transfer information from another language into English, even after the translation step, to make the language more understandable to the American ear, so to speak. So they were localizers. This was therefore is a design feature. That person now is a localizer, and that's something you can add to your list of expertise. But design features actually carries with it I want to focus, at least initially, on this concept of design features. These are the things that you came to the table to improve, things that you came to the table to become. And so a design feature is, like, for example, I'm an internet personality. I've been at it exactly 2.5 years indirectly, but I didn't realize that was where I was focused. But now a design feature is that I am an internet personality and I do podcasting. Who knew? The framework by which we come to life allows us to make design features in advance of having them, because we simply have shown that is the direction and the intent that we are focused on. So, just as in the case of the skills that we learn in developing and building our character, we now use those to design the life function, the life future that we have. So I'm also a futurist. I don't live in 2022. I'm fundamentally operating in 2027 and beyond, because that's where where I know I am going to be, and therefore I might as well establish the route and the course to get there. And by doing so, you become integrated into that mental state. And so by the time we get to 2027, my mind is going to be on to, who knows, 2035, 2050. It all depends on my processing. But the idea of design features is that we create a framework about ourselves that makes us accommodating to the world. We have a reason for us to be a part of the whole, and gives us an inkling on how to proceed towards that. In the case of roleplay games, going back to that one, in the case of a design feature in a roleplay game, certain games go so far as to clearly define these to the exclusion of all others and call them character classes. Well, I balk to that because the reality is that class within the culture is something that we define for ourselves, and we accept or dispute the class characterizations that are placed on us by the world. So based on, for example, the raw data of how much, quote, money I make doing this process, right now it's negligible. It's right now fundamentally a net zero, because I am in the process of creating the resource. I am developing the design feature as internet personality, as radio personality, as novelist and writer in the past. These are all things that we establish as design features, and they carry on with us. I mean, I can list my design features and they become the bullet points of, you know, the saleability of me as a person. Yeah, I'm a former air traffic controller, a former microwave antenna installer, a former cellular technician. I worked on the SR-71 aircraft for the U.S. military. I've been gosh, you name it. I've been a truck driver. I owned a trucking company. I owned a moving company. I owned all these little side businesses that I've developed over time. These all are defining features of who I am, even if they're not in my current, you know, operational arsenal. Although some people would look at my life and say I must still be an air traffic controller because I've got so many wheels in the air, so many functions that are in operation in the ether out there, that I clearly must still be in somewhat of an air traffic controller and able to keep all of that from crashing to the ground. Next is the next piece of the design features that I want to kind of focus on is that design features are scalable. In other words, yes, I have a public speaking background. I have was involved with the Toastmasters organization for several years and achieved the gold level of speaker. There are 1,000 reasons to get involved with an organization like that, but the point is that the public speaking aspect allowed me to communicate throughout my career with crowds as small as, you know, 1 or 2 people across a table in sales, you know, committed communications, all the way up to audiences of 10 and 20,000 at speaking events, conventions, and such. So the ability to speak in public is certainly a design feature, but it also therefore lends itself somewhat to my, if you will, brilliance from our description of character bases, foundations, and also my resolve, because it does take at least some intestinal fortitude to stand on that stage and make a presentation. Now, you can do these things and have colossal success or colossal failure. So it's not like a definer of whether you will succeed or not, but the fact that you have these design features help to create the, if you will, the CV or resume for your existence, and therefore are things that can be, you know, tallied up and itemized in such a fashion. These design features go one step further, as the design features are the definitive descriptors for our existence. So when somebody sees me on a screen, they go, oh yeah, that's that game master with 50 years of experience who's been running games continuously for 50 plus years. That's that at the core, that's who I am. But you could also say all those other things that are in my design features list. So those also apply to descriptors as well. Before we leave this section, therefore, I want to talk about the fact that the way this associates with character building, the idea is that you build the attributes, you define where you are at the core, and then you start defining where you want to be beyond the core, and that those become your design features. Those are the things that elevate you above what you are physically. And I don't mean elevation in the standpoint that makes you a better person, although arguably having a larger skill base by its own very nature is going to make you a better person, to have more to who you are than just, how quickly you can learn or whatever. So, and then finally, how to go from design features to the next part that's coming up is that design features, with the definitions that they are, start to give us a baseline for how we can advance. And this next section we're going to talk about is going to show us the means by which we advance. All right, we now come to establishing tradition. Every time I say the word tradition, I think of Topol from Fiddler on the Roof. Tradition, tradition. Yeah, I can't sing that very well. I sing okay, but and without any music, all that. That was a passable version. Alrighty, so establishing tradition is the means by which we move our design features forward. So, obvious things that our society and our culture already embrace about this concept of establishing tradition is that we have these large institutions called centers of learning. In the most mundane cases, you have your trade schools and your on-the-job trainings. You have the military and such that give you established traditions, means by which you're going to advance the skill bases you have. And these can be as general as general education, first couple of years of college, the way high schools are supposed to operate. As I mentioned, on-the-job trainings quite often have these kind of things where you establish the traditions to do the job. So, for example, in air traffic control, in order to establish the tradition of being able to speak with others, you have to learn how to talk on a radio. So you learn how not to pop your P's or crackle on certain syllables and such when speaking into a microphone. And you can't see it, but my microphone's right here. We start doing unsolicited promotions of these things once we are more established as a show, and perhaps pick them up as a sponsor as well. But the concept, therefore, of establishing tradition is the means by which we build those basic skills into our design features. Some is just rote memorization. When I was in school many years ago, I learned my mathematics, the multiplication tables, division tables, and such by rote memory up to a certain number that was required. You had to learn what, and this is again going to date me, what Jethro Clampett would say from the ancient show Beverly Hillbillies. He'd say, I had to learn me gazintas. 4 gazinta 16 4 times. 4 gazinta 20 5 times. 4 gazinta 24 6 times. I think you get it. So learning your gazintas, learning your multiplication tables and such by rote is one way of doing it. Another might be to learn new math, where they talk about groupings and taking things from the group and moving them into other groups and then rearranging. And it's math. I was really fascinated with the way Japanese children are taught to do their multiplication. I watched a couple of shows on it. Pretty fascinating, physically quick, graphic mechanisms that they use. My camera's still freaking out. The establishing traditions portion of our lives can be internal or external. And I probably get some heat about this, but as a student leaving high school and heading out into life, it is a challenge to embrace going to an establishing tradition that is outside of your familial morals. It's the establishing tradition can be adverse to your familial tradition to that point. So realizing that there are different means of learning, different ways of interacting, it's important that we as individuals establish the traditions that we want in our lives and find ways to avoid or dissociate from those traditions that are not within our framework of what we want in our lives. Parents who have dedicated their lives to their children going to college, bless your hearts. There are some of us that didn't make that as evident to our children as perhaps, and then there are those who mandated the activity that pushed our children into an established tradition that doesn't match with our own, and therefore we wonder when they're grown up and acting strangely or differently from what they did at home. We wonder how that happened, and it's because we allowed them to establish traditions in a different way. But realize that establishing tradition also is referring to the creativity that we have as an individual in terms of active imagination. For example, if you haven't heard the story of the Christmas duck, I'm going to be doing a special video presentation of the story of Bartleby in the next few days. But the establishment of a tradition can come from us doing something in our lives, finding it pleasant enough that we wish to repeat it, and doing so on an ongoing basis. For example, presenting myself as an internet personality means that I'm actually stepping into a framework of that which I want, even in the fact that I don't have a mile of, camera background. I don't have a plethora of diplomas from different schools saying that I've got these skills. Instead, I'm establishing these traditions for my identity in a fashion that I'm controlling. And without going into the huge politics of it, I do believe this is partially what's responsible for the oddness going on in identity politics today, because we are observing others that are trying to exert their traditions, and the difference between previous life experiences and current life experiences is that back in my day, since I'm old, the concept of establishing tradition was limited to what do you do for a living? Where do you go to school? What kind of career path are you on? These were things that you asked about another person's tradition to figure out where they were on the course. But you didn't make judgments. In today's world, those assessments of tradition are being stated outwardly, externally, by the participant, and demanding that you react to it, demanding your acceptance and your participation in their tradition. And I guess the closer you come to this is when my friends who were, when I was a kid and I had friends who were Jewish, they asked, why we didn't have a Hanukkah candle, and I asked them why they didn't have a Christmas tree. These are established traditions done at the family level that the person holds on to, and we don't necessarily judge others, but we ask them about what theirs are, what their traditions are. So this is, I guess, where this idea of identifying pronouns and such come from, is that if you are going to try to reestablish a different framework for identity from that which is already established in culture, you by necessity have to attack the established culture, the established traditions, and force them to be altered. And I think this is a bad step. I think this is not what identity is about. I think identity is about how I interact with myself and where my plans are taking me, and have nothing to do with the outside world. Blessed you if you are watching this show and become one of my viewers, and you want to follow some of the advocacy that I put out. That's not a measure of your identity, and I'm not expecting you to change or conform your established traditions to meet mine, but I let you know what they are so that if you choose to, you can become a participant in it. So on the one hand, establishing that a certain person has a defined set of pronouns, that's great for them. That is awesome if they want to do that. But if they do that, then they can't expect us or me to interact with their framework unless I'm able to establish it with my own as a premise. If your identity requires you to establish your identity to the point where it forces mine to change, that is not establishing a tradition. That's being tyrannical. Enough said. The point here about establishing traditions is that we individually have the capability and the right and the responsibility of establishing those features in our lives that we hope to eventually be design features that others will identify, but we have to establish those by our practice and our experience getting to that point. Alrighty, coming down to the wire here and switching over to, drum roll please, as Galadriel would say, the foundations of the world. Okay, so the idea of foundation is, as we've described before, we build our own identity first. We have to figure out who we are. We have to character build. We have to define what attributes that we have, figure out where our baselines are on those, create that as a foundation, and then establish a pattern beyond that through defining characteristics that we call the design features. As we characteristically define those design features, we have to then start to align our activities to promote them and to expand them and to extend them beyond where we started. And once we've done that, we establish the traditions, the discipline and the training, the advancement, the awareness into those, so that those become the facts of our reality, and not just the hopes, but actually the established traditions of our lives. I can't be an internet personality if I'm not on the internet. I can't be a podcaster unless I'm creating podcasts. I can't make you watch me on video unless I give you an opportunity to see where to go watch them. And NycosRPG is the site that I'm using here on Twitch. I also have another channel as well, but that one's not focused on games per se and doesn't actually talk about games mastery like this. So notice that this entire time we've been officially talking about the way things happen in this world, but I'm utilizing this based on the character building mechanisms of a role-play game that I developed. For more information about that, you'll definitely want to check into the Patreon program, patreon.com/Nycos. But let me go on right here to the foundations. Let's say, for example, I want to change the world's attitude about creativity. And I wanted to initiate in people who are of my generation, maybe even older, perhaps younger, the concept of an active imagination. And I want the person's mental acuity, their cognition, to improve through awareness of a mechanism that would do so. This would be, therefore, establishing a foundation for the world. This is not the world as it is, but this is the world as a person with a Nycos mentality or Nycos mind can have. If you're able to continue the youthfulness you had as a child into later adulthood, you're bringing with you the wonderment and excitement and thrills of your youth, and through your active imagination, processing it into the future. And so this youth continuity is the focus of what we are trying to do. And so in establishing a foundation of the world, it has to be able to stand the pressures of real world impact. You know, if I say you're going to be more creative, I have to have proof in the pudding, right? I can tell you in my life, I never grew up. My son, at the age of 18, declared himself older than me. There was a lot of drama in the world at that point. I'm not going to go into a lot of it, but a lot of things were changing within the framework of life in general. And his comment may have been meant as somewhat of a disparagement, or at least an elevation of himself. But I totally embraced it. I said, fine. If you are officially older than me now at 18, bless your heart. You got so much more to learn. I'm glad you joined the military, because you're going to need it. You're going to need those new steps. And trust me, the establishing traditions of the U.S. Marine Corps helped alter my son's direction in life. And he wouldn't have missed it for the world. He got to see some amazing places. He got to see some dangerous places. He got to do some things that I would never in my life hope to ever do. But in all of those things, he developed his foundation in the world based on those establishing traditions of the military and the design features he wanted for his life. And that was all predicated upon the persona, the presence, the person, the grace that which he came into the world with, and thereby he character built from being a sweet spirit, innocent child, to being a fearless warrior and advocate for America in foreign nations, and now he's established as a father for two, and you know, working his way through life at that level. But the reason why I mentioned the foundations in this last part is that we build our world day by day. We don't come into the world and live by caprice alone. We have to have some focus, some intent, and whether we have it or the world places it upon us, we will establish traditions that lead us to a better understanding and a comprehension of the world as it is. And just realize that as any person can tell you, a change of mind, a change of paradigm, a change of perspective can change the world. And so I'm inviting you, if you like this video, click the link below, letting us know. If you appreciate the message that I say, follow us both here and on Facebook. The links for that are also below. And also check out our Patreon to see what we're doing in the future. I thank you again for your participation today. Thanks again to our sponsors, Board Game Paradise in Redlands, California. And thank you again for watching. This has been Jonathan Albin, and this is Nycos News.